Hello, you wonderful people. So for today's video, I'm gonna make a video kind of making a compare and contrast between the webtoon manhwa Girls of the Wilds versus the live action adaptation Sweet Combat. This will dabble a little bit in spoilers, but it won't be massive spoilers. I don't know if there's a lot you could really spoil about the story. You can, but I'll try to avoid too many spoilers, but I just want to get into something. First and foremost, I really like both versions. Like I said when I made my video on why I love Girls of the Wilds, because at that time I had just finished a webtoon, and I had, while putting that up and looking into it, I found out about Sweet Combat, which came out in 2018. It's a Chinese adaptation of the webtoon manhwa, and I watched all 37 episodes. In fact, I reviewed it, and you can find those on here on YouTube. But yeah, I just wanted to kind of make a video thinking, talking about the comparing and contrast, because I do a lot of the deeper dive into comparing and contrasting during my review of like, oh, this is what they did in the manhwa, this is what they ended up doing in the live action. So if you want more blow by blow, you hear that like episode by episode as I compare stuff as it happens in the live action. I'm like, okay, this is what happens in the manga. So first and foremost, the biggest differences right straight off the bat is the naming. Like, right, the manhwa is Girls of the Wilds, whereas the TV show is called Sweet Combat. There's also, right, it's a webtoon manhwa, so it is set in Korea, it is Korean, whereas Sweet Combat is a Chinese live action adaptation. So obviously the names are different. They also have a slightly different setting. It's still set mainly around a school, whereas Girls of the Wilds is a high school in the webtoon, but in the live action adaptation they made it, it's not even the Wilds, it has a different name. It's college, it's a university, so the characters are slightly older. They're in similar positions, whereas like the main protagonist, Jaegu in the webtoon, Tien in live action version, they're still in the same position of being first years. It's just, like I said, high school versus university. For the most part, the general overarching plot of, hey, you get enrolled at this school that is predominantly female, like 99% female, is still very true. But you do have your core cast that you follow in both stories. It mainly revolves around 4 characters in the webtoon, that being Jaegu, Queen, Daldal, and Moonyoung. And the TV show adaptation has its versions of said characters, but there's also a addition to a new character that exists only for the live action, and that character is Hao. He's in an interesting spot because he's an original character to the story, but he actually embodies some story elements of different characters. There's at least 2 characters he represents. One character is Jaegu, whereas Tien is like the more direct version of Jaegu. He's pretty much the live action version of Jaegu. There's certain elements of Jaegu's story and characteristics and elements that are put into Hao that they gave him certain story beats that exist for Jaegu, but Tien never had them. They ended up going to Hao. So it's stuff like that I think is interesting, but also where his story goes, it is adapting a different character. It's actually a character that's recurring, but he has a very small recurring role in the webtoon. They gave those stories and developments to Hao, and you see that with how his story plays out, of like, especially in, once again, I'm dancing around spoilers, so it's really interesting how that all plays out. A lot of the characters' personalities actually stay the same. Maybe some of but their story trajectories kind of play a little differently. A great example of that would be like, well, I'd actually make the argument like Tien and Jaegu are in an interesting spot as the main protagonists, because I feel like Tien has a little bit more, like a lot of his like reluctancy and kind of like not saying what's really on his mind a lot of times, or how he's really feeling, like that's still there for the most part. But there are parts where I kind of go like, oh, Tien's kind of a little more advanced than Jaegu is, because Jaegu up until the very end is very much like, I'm kind of like, he can be wishy-washy, I guess would be one way to kind of put it, whereas like Tien is a little more like, later on in the story is a little more firm in being like, this is what I want. He kind of draws clear lines, whereas it takes Jaegu, like, he has moments of that in the webtoon, but he kind of like, he takes a step forward and then takes like 2 steps back in that regard. Whereas I feel like Tien, once he gets to that point in the story, he sticks to it and kind of maintains that firmness, which I think is kind of a distinct difference. But also you have Queen versus Fengyu, you being the TV show version, the Sweet Combat version of Queen. those characters pretty much stay the same, a lot of the same quirks. You can be very stoic, great fighter, but I do feel like, you know, her story is an interesting spot, especially in connection to her grandfather, which I think is so interesting. His portrayal is probably the biggest difference amongst the live action versus the webtoon, because he's very much meant to be kind of like, he's a serious character, but he shows up in jokey bits. He uses more comedic bits, and he shows up very infrequently. He only shows up like maybe a dozen times throughout the entire webtoon, whereas in the TV show, he plays a different role. Won't spoil it, but it's a vastly different role he plays in the live action. Even though there's similarities, it's played differently. Like I said, in the webtoon it's played more jokingly. In the live action, it's played a lot more seriously, and that has its own, that causes different things in for Queen in Sweet Combat. In fact, there's a story element related to Jaegu's family that ties into Queen's story in the TV show that does not exist at all in the webtoon. And that's actually something I think is interesting. We dive a little more into Jaegu's family. It's just a part of his story of, yes, his dad died and his mom abandoned him. There's a little more to that in the webtoon version. In fact, things play out a little differently. Their mom, him and his siblings' mom left, and then their dad died sometime after. So things are in reverse in that regard, and there's story beats for it, and how part of Tien's story in Sweet Combat plays into Queen's story and how they're connected. It becomes a major hurdle for their story. That hurdle does not exist. They have the same hurdles of just them being who they are, not being able to be clear about how they feel about each other, exist in the webtoon and the TV show, but this extra hurdle is a very specific hurdle that only exists in Sweet Combat, the TV show. So I think that's fascinating. You take someone like Xaomi, who is the Daldal equivalent, see, pretty much the same character through and through. I am kind of sad we don't get to experience her family, whereas like her mom in particular is a recurring character in the webtoon, but you don't get to meet her mom at all. I guess arguably you could say like Hao's mom kind of fills that role to some extent, considering like Xiaomi's like mom doesn't, like I said, doesn't even pop up at all. There's a character that pops up in like a TV show thing that I don't know if that was like a slight wink and nod to her mom in the webtoon or not. Like I said, it's not something that's touched on at all. But like I said, she's a pretty recurring character in the webtoon, so I thought that was interesting. And then, but for the most part, her story, it plays out exactly the same way. You know, like I said, some differences here and there, but for the most part, her story is pretty much exactly like it was in the webtoon. And then you get to Yanan, who is the Moonyoung equivalent. See, her story pretty much plays out the same, except her love story. It plays out a little differently. It's never fully explored, but it, you know, Moonyoung finds someone that she's interested in. Pretty early on in both the webtoon and the TV show, she pretty much goes like, okay, I'm interested in Jaegu or Tien, but eventually that moves on, and like she really leans into like a whole, you're like a brother to me. I think she's in both versions. She treats the main protagonist like a brother. I can't remember. I feel like that might have just been something for the live action, but I feel like it was also in the webtoon, or maybe it was in the webtoon and it just kind of implied and it's there in the live. I don't remember now. But for the most part, her characterization is still the same. Her being tough and tumble, and maybe like they lean into like her feeling not as girly. Like that becomes a little bit of her self-consciousness. Like that's more of her in the live action. They don't really ever do that in the webtoon, because she kind of accepts like, no, this is who I am. She's pretty firm in who she is, but like that's a little bit of her like insecurities. But like I said, her love story plays out a little differently in the webtoon. I mean, in the TV show than it does in the webtoon, because it's not. Like I said, there's someone she likes, and it's kind of hinted at, but we never know what the future that is. It's pretty clear cut in the live action, because you see the progression of that relationship and actually see like the back and forth that becomes that situation. So, I mean, I think that in itself is actually something the live action I think does really interesting. It really leans into the relationships. Like, this is kind of entering spoiler territory, whereas like Jaegu and Queen, you never actually get to see them date. They get together at the very end of the webtoon. I mean, it literally ends with them being reunited in Japan, and then like they don't even get to kiss. Whereas in the TV show, those characters kiss. Their story, and kind of a spoiler in that regard, I'd say the live action ends pretty much the same way that the TV show does, but like not everything around the ending is exactly the same, but the feeling and vibe of the ending is the same. It's just how you got there is not 100% the same, and the actual ending in its entirety is not entirely the same. But like the feel and vibe and a lot of the events are still the same. It's really interesting. But like a point I was making is like Tien and Queen actually date in the TV show. We actually get to see them as a couple, which I really appreciate that. The fact is, like, there's a lot more emphasis on them actually being in a relationship. It's not just a will they, won't they, which is like I said, the entirety of the manga, which I mean, the entirety of the manhwa, which I don't have an issue with, but I can know that'd be frustrating. But you actually, a good chunk of the way, like throughout Sweet Combat, that happens until they actually do go on a date. And once again, they have their hurdles and it leads to some complications in the relationship, but they still end up actually dating, being boyfriend and girlfriend, which I think is actually really cute. And I think I really appreciate the show sticking with that, making that decision and sticking with it, and us getting to see them as an actual couple. And it's actually kind of interesting. Like I said, it's something you don't get to see at all in the webtoon. We see how they are around each other, but that's without them really defining like, okay, we're dating, we're boyfriend and girlfriend. Whereas like they made that delineation in the live action. Another interesting difference is there is a massively large group of minor or recurring characters in the webtoon. There's characters that pop up super infrequently throughout the webtoon, but they don't quite exist in the live action. There's quite a few characters that kind of fit that bill. You see some characters where you're like, oh, I think that's supposed to be the live action equivalency, but like it's never really fully defined. There are some characters that are absent in their entirety. There are, like I said, some characters are just like amalgamations of others. So like, and like it's also not story beat for story beat. There are a lot of story beats taken from the webtoon. Maybe things don't fully happen in the same order, but like there are story beats that are just not, like some of the more like, they're not slice of life elements. Maybe there could, because I think Girls of the Wilds probably could be labeled as slice of life in a lot of capacities, but there's some story beats and life elements and arc elements that are completely not there in the TV show, and there are others that are straight from the webtoon that are one for one. Some are just kind of like, okay, you're there, like it's the arc, but they changed some things. So like I said, I'm trying not to get too specific, because I talked about, I don't think I've ever talked about it, but it's like, if you've ever read the webtoon, I would highly recommend checking out the live action. Maybe it's not your cup of tea in some of its approaches to things, but I think it's so, as a fan of Girls of the Wilds, I thoroughly enjoyed it. I'm not saying everyone else would feel that way, but I'd say check out an episode or two and see how you feel about it. But I really loved it, and I loved the things they kept the same, some of the things that they changed, but overall I'm just like super satisfied with it all around. So I think it's a great live action adaptation, and it's like, I'm bummed we never got an anime adaptation. Who knows what the future holds? Like, as we've seen in more recent years, there are some things that came out years ago as manga that are now finally getting like an anime adaptation. So you never know what the future holds, but I hope the series would eventually get an anime adaptation. But this being the only adaptation we have, I think it's a great adaptation. It keeps the heart and soul of what makes the characters and the stories and the romance elements to it so true to the webtoon. Like, I think the live action Sweet Combat embodies that so perfectly and beautifully, while also adding to it. And because I feel like a lot of the additions it added were like I said, like actually letting us see Queen and Tien date. It, to me, feels like it would be the natural progression between like Queen and Jaegu. It feels like, no, those characters would probably act like that as a couple. So, but that's just me. I'm kind of all over the place, so I do apologize. But like I said, for the most part, like, you know, they're pretty succinct with each other, and just like, but so it's an interesting thing, because I still think it is well worth it because of those differences. They are. It's not like it's massively different, but the differences are enough there that it does make Sweet Combat a different enough experience that you don't feel like you're fully like repeating everything from the webtoon. So it makes it a very unique experience while also feeling similar, but also like greatly different at the same time, but not so different that it feels like it lost some of the heart that made Girls of the Wild Girls of the Wild. So this is just my perspective on it. I'd love to get to know your thoughts in the comments down below. Which version have you seen? Have you read Girls of the Wilds but never watched Sweet Combat, or vice versa? Has my video in any shape or form convinced you to check out the other version? Whether you've maybe only seen Sweet Combat but never seen the original webtoon, because maybe for whatever reason you never knew that Sweet Combat was based on a webtoon. So yeah, just let me know all your thoughts in the comments down below. But really, that's all I want to talk about. To the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day and good